Hello, my name is Jed Murdoch and welcome to Module 12 on reserve design. In this module, we'll cover some of the considerations, the basic considerations for designing reserves for single and multiple species. My colleague Terry will join us a little bit later and she'll build a spreadsheet and walk you through a spreadsheet exercise that will allow you to explore the relationships between species and habitats and the configuration of habitats that will allow you to see how you might be able to designs that effectively maximize the protection of a species. So with that said, let's begin. Perhaps one of the greatest threats to biodiversity conservation is the loss of habitat, or the fragmentation of habitat, which can result in all sorts of influences, all sorts of impacts on plants and animals. And certainly those impacts can be quite substantial for some species. I think about tigers, for example, right? One of the largest cats. Tigers once ranged across much of Asia, but in the last century, their historic range now has been contracted by about 90 to 93%. So that's a pretty substantial impact, and much of that contraction in range has been due to the fragmentation and the loss of habitat. So that loss has come through urban and suburban developments, agricultural developments, roads, and so forth, and unfortunately now the tiger is an endangered species. So how do we go about engaging in species-level conservation for tigers or for other species? One means of doing that is to create protected areas, national parks, refuges, and the like. So protected areas can be a very valuable tool in terms of enhancing the conservation of individual species, but we know the protected areas that have been created worldwide have had a variety of other aims as well. So some have been geared towards protecting groups or assemblages of species. Others have focused on protecting ecological services that a landscape may be providing, or various cultural heritage issues related to cultural heritage. Nonetheless, with respect to species-level conservation, protected areas are really an important contribution and really an important tool. So for example, if you consider our largest crane species here in North America, the whooping crane, not many wild whooping cranes left. I don't know, anywhere between perhaps 300 and 500. And they really exist only in two protected areas. They spend their winters down in Aransas National Wildlife Refuge in Texas and some of the surrounding areas. And then they nest up in Wood Buffalo National Park in Canada, a good 2,500 miles away, and they actually will migrate between those two areas. So you might argue that without those protected areas, we could very well see the extinction of one of the iconic species of North America. So in the modern world, we have, of course, a good deal of human influence on the landscape, and we do have a good number of protected areas out there. However, there are still protected areas being created. So the old notion that we've just created as many protected areas as we can and that's it is not necessarily true. We're still engaging in creating protected areas for species and multiple species. And let me give you two recent examples. The first example is the recent creation of the Termit and Tintuoma National Nature and Cultural Reserve in Niger in North Africa. This reserve was created by the Niger government in partnership with communities, nonprofit organizations like the Sahara Conservation Fund, and a variety of partners. And it was created in 2012, in early 2012. Now this thing was created to really protect species that are native to the Saharan desert ecosystem. Some really unusual critters like Addis antelope and Dama gazelle, Saharan cheetah, Barbary sheep, and a variety of birds and reptile species as well. Now this thing is a monster. It's 97,000 square kilometers in size. That's about 37,000 square miles. And to put that into perspective, it's about the size of the state of Indiana or the size of the country of Hungary. Really a massive area. And it's in fact the largest protected area in continental Africa and one of the largest in the world, recently created to protect those species that reside in or are characteristic of Saharan ecosystems in North Africa. Another example involves the creation of a reserve for snow leopards in the South Gobi of Mongolia. So this reserve was created in partnership between communities, nonprofits, government agencies as well. This thing's a little bit smaller, 6,700 square kilometers, about the size of Delaware, to give you some perspective. And really its mission is to enhance conservation, to maximize conservation of a single species, and that being the snow leopard, which is native to a large portion of Mongolia, or at least the sort of mountainous regions.
So managers are often tasked with creating reserves, or groups or networks of reserves that have some sort of common goal or some conservation or management objective. Right? So that might be creating reserves for snow leopards, that might be creating reserves for a whole suite of species occurring in the Sahara ecosystem. So we have this problem of how to design an effective reserve or reserve system, right? And that can be a great challenge. Now, in the past, we've oftentimes relied on ecology and ecological factors and things we know about ecology to help inform the way we make decisions about the shape and size of different reserves. So I'm going to briefly run through a few of those different factors here, and let's just use a hypothetical example of snow leopards again. So transport yourself now to the Altai Mountains of Mongolia, and our objective here is to create a reserve for snow leopards, a new one. So let's look at this first factor here. You've got two possible reserves, one on the left and one on the right. The one on the left is obviously quite large, and the one on the right is quite small. So which of these two options do you suppose might be better for our snow leopard population? Well, most people would probably say the large reserve, right? The bigger one's probably better. Now, why would that be? Well, snow leopards are a large-bodied species, right? They are big animals, they have big spatial requirements, and not only that, they occupy very large home ranges. So we would probably assume that a large area could probably support more snow leopards than a smaller area. And that's probably a good thing if our objective is to create a reserve that effectively protects the species. Another issue, if we're considering multiple species now, is that we know that there is a positive relationship between species number and area. So if we're concerned with biodiversity conservation, for example, the bigger an area gets, the more species it's likely to harbor. And that's a fairly general rule in ecology that's encapsulated by something called the species-area relationship that we won't go into in great detail, but I will mention something called Darlington's rule, and that basically states that for every tenfold increase in the size of an area, we should expect to see about a doubling of the number of species, and that holds fairly constant. It's a good rule of thumb. So large areas can probably support more species as well. So a general guiding factor, you might say, related to ecology is size, and that's informed decision making about reserves in the past. Now let's look at a couple of other factors. Let's look at number 2 now. Here you've got 3 reserves that are clustered relatively close together on the left, and then on the right you've got 3 reserves that are more distantly separated, right? They're more isolated. So which of these do you suppose might be better for our snow leopards? Well, again, most would probably say the reserves that are tightly clustered. And why would that be? Well, reserves that are closer together probably allow for more connections to occur. In other words, it's probably easier for a snow leopard in this reserve to reach this one or to disperse to this one than it is for a snow leopard here to disperse to this one. It's just simply a shorter distance. So there's a greater degree perhaps of connectivity here that might facilitate the movement of individuals around the landscape. And that could have benefits with respect to genetics, so it might increase gene flow across the area. It may also have importance from a population perspective too. So if snow leopards are existing as a metapopulation in the landscape, this movement here that the clustering creates may facilitate colonization. So if there's an area, a subpopulation in a metapopulation that is extinct but can be occupied, this closeness then may allow for colonization to occur a little bit more easily. So in this way, I would probably write isolation as an important guiding ecological principle that's informed our reserve decisions in the past, right? So the less isolated you are, probably the better for individual species. And then also from a biodiversity perspective, we know that the further away areas are, the more isolated they are, the less likely they are to probably contain a higher number of species than less isolated places, right? So isolation has been an important factor. If we look at number 3 here, we've got 2 reserves on the left that are connected by this sort of linear strip of habitat. And on the right, we've got unconnected reserves in this landscape. So which of the 2 here might be a better option? Well, on the left, we've got connectivity. And again, most people would probably suggest that having these 2 landscapes connected, these 2 reserves connected, is probably a good thing. Now, this, of course, relates to our overall management objectives, but connectivity comes with many of the advantages that we just talked about here relative to unconnected sites. So this one may be a better option for our snow leopards. But I will say that connectivity and the creation of corridors between areas does sometimes come with some negative consequences. So what might some of those be? Well, we know that perhaps disease can transfer from one area to another when they're connected. We know that things like fire or invasive species can easily, in some circumstances, move from one area to another. So connectivity sometimes comes at some costs. There may be genetic costs as well. We have cases of outbreeding occurring, and we have a module on outbreeding that might be worth reviewing here. So I'm going to write here connectivity as another ecological principle that has informed our decision making in the past. Lastly, let's look at number 4 as another ecological guide. You've got 2 reserves here, one on the left that looks like a circle and one on the right that looks like a pancake. Which might be better perhaps for snow leopards than the other? Well, again, it's going to depend really on our management goals and objectives, but shape is an important factor. And one of the reasons for that is that shape, in many ways, dictates how much edge we actually have in our reserve. So let's think about this reserve here on the left as being a forest fragment. So it's a forest patch, and it's surrounded by a sea of grassland, so a very different habitat on the outside. So we know that at the edge, we know that conditions might in fact be a little bit different than they are in the interior. Even though the edge may look like great forested habitat, it might be very different. So why would it be different? Well, we might have species from the outside, grassland species like predators, that can incur a certain distance into the forest patch. We might have wind that can also incur a certain distance, and other factors that have an influence on this edge zone. So these edge effects, like predators and wind and so forth, can really change the nature of edge systems, and that can be good or bad for some species, depending on those that are conservation priorities or those that you're interested in working with. Why can they be bad? Well, in some circumstances, these edge areas can become sink habitats. They can also become ecological traps in some circumstances. And again, we've got some modules on those concepts that you might be interested in reviewing. So on the left, we have a circle, and a circle, of course, has the least amount of perimeter, the least amount of edge relative to area. Any departure from that circle, like this pancake over here, will increase that amount of edge relative to area. So oftentimes in the past we have focused our efforts on reserve design in terms of minimizing edge effects. But again, it relates to the species of interest and the conservation goals and objectives. But edge has been an important ecological consideration in reserve design in the past. So again, we have oftentimes used ecology and ecological factors in decision making. But we certainly know that the practicalities of creating reserves and reserve networks can be quite complex and quite complicated, and oftentimes involve other factors like economic factors, and certainly there are social factors as well. So when we approach the problem again of designing reserves, those designs can be informed by ecology, but also need to take into account economic and social factors, and again, that can be quite complicated, as you can imagine. So how do we then approach this problem of reserve design? Well, there are lots of different approaches, and perhaps a more modern approach involves using a decision-making framework. And so I'm going to outline one here called a 7-step decision theory framework. And that sounds like a huge mouthful, but it's really quite straightforward. There's 7 key factors, 7 key things that we should address to help us arrive at a better decision and a perhaps less biased decision geared towards a management goal or objective in terms of designing a reserve or a reserve network. So it's 7 key steps. And these steps here and the exercises that will follow really are partly based on a free software program and an approach that they use. And this program is called Marxan. And you can search for it online. It's a decision support software that again takes into consideration all of these different ecological, economic, social factors and sifts through them and helps you make decisions about which reserves to include in a network. It helps you design these things. And it really relies on this decision theory framework that we'll go through just now. So let's jump into it. These steps are pretty straightforward, but I think they're important to recognize right off the bat. So the first one is really to state your management objective. Wow, that seems very basic, right? Oftentimes this step is glossed over or it's not explicitly stated, and I think it's very important to be sure that your objective is clearly stated at the beginning of any reserve design exercise. So our objective for snow leopards in the Altai might be to create a reserve or a network of reserves that harbors at least 75 individuals. Why 75? Well, we might have conducted some sort of population viability analysis that gave us that number, and we do have a module about that that might be handy to look at. So that might be one objective for snow leopards. Or it might be that we have, let's say, 15 different species of concern, conservation priority species, and we want to ensure that our reserve network includes or represents all 15 of those species. So they occur across our reserve network. So stating that management objective is really important right off the bat. Number 2 is listing management options. So in the case of snow leopards, we can't just simply go out and protect the entire Altai mountain range, right? We have only certain options available to us. There are only certain areas that we can protect, and there are others that we can't. So identifying those options is really key. What are those options, those potential reserves that we could include in our network? The third one here is stating the variables. So what are the variables or those things that we need to know in our various options that will allow us to achieve our objective. So what are those variables? In the case of snow leopards, the variable would be what? It would probably be the number of snow leopards in each one of these potential options, right? So we need to know how many snow leopards are out there, how many occur in each one of our areas, because that's what we need to know in order to get at our final objective. Number 4 is stating the dynamics of the system, and we're not going to really cover that so much in this module, but I think it's worth mentioning. So we know that nature is really dynamic. It's not a static entity, and we know that landscapes change, and so capturing that amount of change can help us make better decisions at the beginning about which reserves to include in a network. So think about climate change, for example. A warming climate may affect plant communities, which may affect the ungulate populations in a particular reserve that snow leopards feed on, which may then trickle up to influencing the number of snow leopards in that particular reserve. So getting a handle on how these reserves, how our different options may change from one period to another or over time may be quite important in terms of sustaining or having a long-term success with respect to our objective. Number 5 here is constraints. And this is an important one. What are the constraints that we're dealing with in our reserve design? Now, a big constraint that we all face in our daily lives even is cost, right? Things cost money. We probably have a budget that we're trying to work with. Obtaining or buying, let's say, parcels of land to designated reserves comes at a cost. So that's a big constraint, and it's key to understand and quantify what those constraints really are explicitly. Number 6, this is another one that we will not really cover in this module, but it's worth mentioning, and that is uncertainty and quantifying the amount of uncertainty in our data sources. So we're dealing with variables, we're dealing with numbers that are used to achieve our conservation objective. And we know oftentimes that those numbers can come with some level of uncertainty. If you've ever worked with GIS or GIS habitat maps, classified habitat maps from a satellite image, or any sort of habitat map, you know that there's some degree of uncertainty. These classifications aren't perfect. There are some errors that occur, and recognizing that amount of uncertainty is important. If you look at our snow leopards, for example, if we are out counting snow leopards in each one of our options, so to speak, we know that snow leopards are really hard to count. And so there's going to be some variability in our estimates of snow leopard numbers. And so quantifying that amount of variability then can be important in terms of, again, trying to make the best decisions we can about which reserves to include in a network. Now the last one here is solution methods. And here basically the point is that these problems, again, can be quite complicated and quite complex, right? So we might have multiple objectives with multiple options and many different variables that we're trying to measure, complicated state dynamics, different constraints, a variety of uncertainties in our variables, and so the old pen and paper method just becomes very challenging and really difficult. So oftentimes we rely on making decisions based on solutions that are arrived at through algorithms and optimization methods. And programs like Marxan are really good at taking all of this information in and trying to identify reserves that meet particular objectives. So solution methods often rely on pretty heavy computation that come from various software programs. Now, at this point, I'm going to pass you over to my colleague Terry. She has a really neat spreadsheet exercise that's going to introduce a reserve design problem, a pretty straightforward one, but one that I think will allow you to explore many of the things that we've covered. So there'll be a general objective, And that objective is to maximize the conservation of 10 different species, right? Now there'll be a variety of different options. There'll be 8 potential reserves that can be included in this network. And the idea is to find the minimum number that meet our particular objectives. So the variables that will be measured, at the beginning the variables will include the presence or absence of species in each one of those reserves. So are our species of interest occurring in a reserve or not occurring in a reserve? And later on we'll come back and introduce abundance as another variable and look at how that may change or influence decisions we make about designing a reserve network. So we won't really cover state dynamics in this example or uncertainty, but there will be constraints. There'll be a budgetary constraint, right? There is a cost. We only have so much money, and we're trying to achieve this conservation within that constraint. Lastly, we have a bonus video that will offer a solution method using something called Solver, and that's an add-in to Excel, an add-in to this spreadsheet that helps you, again, solve slightly more complicated problems. Many of the things that we'll cover in the spreadsheet will be solved manually using equations in Excel, but I think you'll see the utility of Solver, and I'd encourage you to watch that bonus video afterwards. So with that said, let me pass you to Terry, and I'll see you in a little bit.